Okay, this is prompt B, and we are going to go through an example of how to complete the DBQ worksheet starting from step 1. This prompt explain and assess the varying underlying causes of the American Revolution and determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away from Great Britain. Use the documents and your knowledge of the period 1754 to 1776 in constructing your response. And so the first thing a person would see, of course, is their DBQ worksheet. The first thing that it asks you to do is to write the prompt. So in this case, I'm just typing or pasting the prompt, but a person would actually write it. And so the reason that you write the prompt down is so you can kind of take your time to evaluate what is the prompt, what are the different components, and what is it really asking you. And so it asks you to break down the prompt and determine the various things in which the prompt is asking. And so one of the things it's asking is what caused the American Revolution. This first part of the prompt, explain and assess the underlying causes of the American Revolution. Well, that's the first component, and this is not singular. These are this part here. It's not just one event. So I'll make that more descriptive. Which various events caused the American Revolution, because it is plural here, causes. And then the second part of the prompt, it commands us to determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. So the second thing that it's asking us to do, um, or asking us which single cause most enticed the colonists to break away. So we already know the format and the structure. There are various events that caused the revolution, and that's with all global conflicts, or most wars. It's not just one event, it's a series of events. And the second part, we have to make a judgment here, the single cause that most enticed the colonists. This is not fact. This is going to be your opinion backed up with evidence or some type of a defense or an explanation. And so, anyway, the next part of the DBQ worksheet asks us to jot down the main idea of each document. And so with this component, you just want to be as descriptive as you can, especially keeping the question in mind, kind of what you're looking for. So here, when you see document A of this British Order in Council, it's mostly talking about the Treasury and justifying why revenue is being raised. And so there are so many different ways to conceptualize this document and to get the main idea, but this is just one example. Document A, British officials justified why more revenue was needed from the colonies. And I put in parentheses military protection, because that's what was referenced here in the document, when the military establishment necessary for maintaining these colonies requires a large revenue to support it. So document B here is a document by James Otis, and he's the guy who's given credit for coining the phrase no taxation without representation. And so when you read through his document, obviously already you know he's going to be a defender of colonial authority and against British rule. And so one example of a main idea sentence: the people should have the right to influence their government, but the colonists have no representation in Parliament. And so reading through this document, we get a glimpse of his governmental beliefs and also what is his primary point, which of course was that the colonists had no representation. And so going on down to document C, you see an image. And anytime that you see a picture, just any angle, and that's kind of the same way with an excerpt, a piece of text that you're reading, any angle that you'd like to approach, you can talk about just that one snippet or that one component. It doesn't, or you could be more comprehensive in your analysis. And so here, this is a map of various different stamp posts. We see various different stamp posts all over the colonies. And so, an example of a main idea sentence here, and here the stamp, this is the place to affix the stamp. And so, an example of a main idea sentence here, well, the British levied a tax on all paper goods through the Stamp Act. And we used some of our background knowledge to construct that main idea sentence. It didn't tell us, the picture didn't tell us what the tax applied to what the tax applied, but we knew that from studying this period. So anyway, document D, these are the resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress. We know the Stamp Act Congress convened for the sole purpose of repealing the Stamp Act or speaking out against the Stamp Act, and they were successful in getting that legislation overturned. And so a potential main idea sentence here, the colonists fought to repeal the Stamp Act because they had no representation in Parliament. And so they will talk about their representatives, and they will talk about consent and also what they believe are the rights of Englishmen. And so here, document E, we see another image. This is an engraving of the Boston Massacre. It is Paul Revere's rendition. He was not there, but this is how he chose to display the event and circulate it around the colonies. And so, an example of a main idea sentence here kind of just describe what you see, or you could even talk about Paul Revere's role. But British soldiers shot and killed 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. So that's what we see here in document E. Document F is an excerpt that is describing another act or another event rather that gained a lot of attention in colonial America leading up to the Revolution, and that's the Boston Tea Party. And so an example of a main idea sentence here after a student reads through this document is something to the matter of protest groups disguised their identity and destroyed 114 chests of English tea. So that's in essence what happens here when the Boston Tea Party occurred. Document G is a document it's a legislative document from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So this is actually just a document that applied to Virginia, but it does give us some insight into what were the values, belief systems, and preferred structure of government from those who resided in that area. And so when you read through the Declaration of Rights, there are various different sections that give us a hint as to how are they, the colonists, interpreting rights. And so political leaders in Virginia declared that all men were equally free and should have the right to vote. So that is explicitly listed in the document when you read it carefully. And the last document, document H, was written by Thomas Jefferson, and so this here was the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, and you read through it, you will see some very familiar wording. And so document H, Jefferson declared that all men were created equal and that it was the right of the people to alter or abolish a destructive government. And so once a student gets the main idea from each document, then it's time to organize the documents and establish categories. Now the tough part about this prompt is that the question did not suggest categories. It just asks you to assess the underlying causes. So what we're going to have to do is somehow we're going to have to establish different categories of causes. And so there are so many different ways that a person can do this. This is just one example or one way to organize the documents. And so one thing that stuck out to me, obviously, is the referencing of taxation. Documents A and C had a theme, and both of those documents in some way referenced, there was increased taxation that occurred in the colonies. And so, and when you go back up to documents A and C, that is the one of the picture of the stamp posts, and also the British Order in Council that referenced, they're kind of justifying why increased taxes were being levied. They use the reasoning of military protection, but whatever the reason, the taxes are still going up, and so that seems to be a factor in colonial America. The next group of documents, document well, that seem to have some kind of correlational theme. Documents B and D. And in both of those documents, there seems to be a reference of political representation, but more so the lack of political representation. So when you go back to documents B and D, one is from James Otis, and he's talking about the rights of British colonies, and particularly they don't have representation in Parliament. And then document D, we see the same reference. One of the reasons used when the resolutions for this of the Stamp Act Congress were crafted was this idea that government is only legitimate if the people in which is governed give their consent, and also by their representatives. So we saw a reoccurring theme of representation, and the colonists seem to be protesting or in some way trying to point out to the government officials that they don't have that representation. That's for the most part why they are unsettled. Documents E, G, and H kind of clumped together here. And the more documents that you add in a category, the broader the category is going to be. I mean, you're going to have to kind of expand the label so that it applies appropriately to all of the documents. But E, G, and H tended to have some kind of theme here of either limited freedom, limited equality, or some kind of restriction. So here, the Boston Massacre, because the British troops were stationed in the colonies, they're going to have limited freedom. That leads to conflict, or it causes conflict very easily. Document G here, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. They are listing all of the various different rights that they believe citizens should have. So obviously they don't have those under British rule, so that's another testament to limited freedom. And then here in document H, some of the wording of the Declaration of Independence, there the colonists also interpreted that all men, and we'll talk about, are created equal, the connotation that was used when this document was written. So obviously they did not feel like they had freedom or equality for them to have to explicitly state this. And so the only thing that leaves us is document F, and it's okay, it's completely fine for a doc or only one document to be in a category. And so document F, one overview category heading for it would be the few economic advantages that the colonists had. And so when you go back to document F, and so that's what enticed the Boston Tea Party, how the colonial merchants were being cut out of the tea trade. And so this is kind of the hard part, after you organize all the documents that have some type of relational theme, and then you label that theme, you pretty much answered the question in each group. And so the primary question is, what were the causes of the American Revolution? And so here, the first category was increased taxation. And so in category 1, well, increased taxation in the colonies was a cause of the American Revolution. And in category 2, okay, well, what were some of the causes of the American Revolution? Category 2 was about lack of representation. Well, lack of representation was a cause of the American Revolution. When you go on down to category 3, what were the causes of the American Revolution? Limited colonial freedom was a cause of the American Revolution. And then category 4, we also established that, few economic advantages was a cause of the American Revolution. So after you get the claim in each category, claim just meaning answer the question in each category, then you put all of these components together, and that pretty much is your thesis. And so what we've done so far with all of these various different categories: increased taxation in the Americas, the lack of political representation, and the absence of economic advantage were all causes of the American Revolution. Now, the second part of the question asks us what was the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away? So we can't neglect or abandon that component of the sentence or of the prompt. We have to explicitly reference what we are affirming as the single most important cause. And so the unequal treatment they received as British subjects was the single cause that most enticed them to rebel against the king. And so notice here that that is a very broad overview statement. The unequal treatment they received as British subjects, that's kind of just a recurring theme. It's not one specific event that happened on one day, but we've crafted it so that it is a singular event.